Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology. I serve as the host of our program. With me today are two of our viewmeisters, regular viewmeisters. On my right is Regina Nelson. Regina is in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University. I always have to look at my cheat sheet on you because the name of your department is so long. Also, our regular viewmeister, commentator Don Cooney. Don is at the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University and also serves as the Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And didn't have to worry about election night this year, right? And we have a special guest with us this time around, John Clark, who is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Western Michigan University. And so since we wanted to focus on the recent elections, we thought we'd bring John back. He's been on the program before. Before we get to the election, however, I want to draw your attention back to the middle of the table and point out that we recently won an award. Critical Issues, Alternative Views was given an award from the Public Media Network for narrative impact was what the award was for. We were one of the 4 big awards that the Public Media Network gives out annually, and we're very, very proud to have won this award. And we just wanted to highlight that fact once again and congratulate everyone who's involved with the production of the program. In particular, our great production crew. Yes. Back there spinning the dials, Daniel Smith, Larry Mahana, Bob Kilday, and our floor manager, John Provencher, is not with us today, but John's a big part of the program as well. So again, just wanted to congratulate everyone involved for winning the award. So John, let's get to the election. What were your big takeaways from the 2022 midterm elections?
Yeah, well, it's great to be back, and it's especially great to be back on an award-winning program. It's a big deal for me. As somebody who pays a lot of attention to elections, and certainly not the only one at Western who does, but there were kind of 3 things for me that are helpful for me to sort of think about the picture, not just in Michigan, but nationally. Yeah. The first thing is that in almost every election, there's something for everybody to be happy about. It's not the same thing for everybody, certainly, and the flip side of that is that there's probably something that folks are upset or disappointed about. But in virtually every election cycle, there are things for folks to sort of say, well, yeah, we didn't get this, but at least we got that. I'm happy about this. I wish that would have turned out differently.
You win some, you lose some.
You win some, you lose some, right? And because in the United States we have so many elections for so many different offices, it's almost always the case that people can focus on the positive, they can focus on the negative, but there's something for everybody. Second big takeaway is that 2 of the most important things in elections generally are turnout, candidate quality. Those prove to be super important in this election cycle. And we'll talk more about each of those, I assume, as we walk through some specific races and specific contexts. But there are folks who, from cycle to cycle, sort of pretend those things aren't important, that it isn't important who actually shows up and votes on Election Day. And there are folks who think, well, it doesn't really matter who the candidates are. We can roll anybody out there, and we're going to get the same result no matter what. Folks in both of those, folks who think each of those things were clearly wrong in this election cycle. Mm-hmm. Turnout was especially important in the large number of really close races nationwide and here in Michigan. Candidate quality also had a huge impact on the kinds of people who won and the kinds of people who lost. We can't always, we don't always know how that part's going to break, right? We don't always know who's going to be a quality candidate until we know whether or not they've connected with voters. But I think that was really important. And then the last big takeaway for me was that going into the election, I think a lot of folks thought this was going to be an election that was driven by change, the desire for something new. And what we ended up with, both here in Michigan and in much of the rest of the country, was an election where incumbents did really well. Mm-hmm. And so it was less about change and more about things staying the same. Again, not just here in Michigan, but in lots of other parts of the country as well. I don't think most people expected that going into Election Day. I think most people thought, there's a lot of anger in the electorate, there's a lot of frustration. This is going to be a year where there are a lot of changes that are going to take place. And we just didn't see that.
And historically, I think you political scientists always say that midterm elections generally are going to go to the party that's not in power, right?
That's right.
And so that was feeding the expectation for the red wave, right? And the dissatisfaction with inflation and other issues.
Yep.
And so there was a lot of expectation, at least on the part of Republicans, that they were going to have a big night just because of those historical trends, right?
Absolutely. And that was the expectation on a lot of Republicans' minds. It was the expectation of a lot of Democrats too. So if you listen to candidates and to leaders in the run-up to the election, Democrats were really trying to prepare their voters for, hey, things might not go so well. And it turned out that, again, there were things for everybody to grasp onto as being good things. But certainly the expectations of a lot of folks that Republicans were going to do really well in this election cycle, that just didn't materialize.
Yeah. Let's talk about Michigan as a case. Not a red wave, but in fact, perhaps a blue tsunami would be more of a way to characterize it. And I'm not sure that many in the Michigan GOP can say anything positive about the election, right? Very, very little seemed to go right for the Republicans. And you mentioned candidate quality, and there was a headline in the Detroit Free Press this morning, I don't know if you saw it, but Michigan GOP says, why did we let Donald Trump pick the candidates? And so there's a lot of angst because, wow, Michigan, the governor was reelected, Secretary of State reelected, Attorney General reelected, both the State House and the State Senate flipped from Republican control to Democratic control. The 3 ballot proposals, which were, I think, mostly favored by Democratic-leaning voters, all 3 passed concerning expanding voting rights and enshrining reproductive rights into the Constitution. And even, the Grand Rapids Congressional District that's been held by Republicans forever flipped to the Democrats. Hillary Scholten defeated the Republican candidate who had lost in a primary. Peter Meyer had lost in a primary to John Gibbs, and then Scholten beat Gibbs. So I don't think that the Republican Party has too much to be happy about with the Michigan results. But what do you think about what happened here in Michigan?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's certainly a couple of particular elections that Michigan Republicans might be pleased about. They might be pleased about, in the national picture, it looks like Republicans are going to take control of the United States House of Representatives at the congressional level. This was not a good year for Republicans in Michigan. I think that that's pretty safe to say. I think that there are a number of factors that sort of lead into this, and I'm sure we won't, I don't want to make it sound like it's just sort of one thing, but it's kind of different at the state legislative level perhaps than it is for those top executive offices. They all kind of blend together in some ways though, because the fact that Democrats did well at the top of the ticket meant that Democrats also did well further down the ticket, but there were other things at play going on too. Let's start first with those top 3 races for governor, for attorney general, and for Secretary of State. It's important to keep in mind that in Michigan we nominate candidates for governor through primaries, so voters have the opportunity to choose the gubernatorial candidate. But the other two offices, those other 2 statewide offices, are nominated by the party conventions. And so the Republican primary, people that voted in the Republican primary selected Tudor Dixon as their nominee. Delegates to the Republican state convention selected the other candidates, and that's actually also true for other statewide candidates. So the state Supreme Court, State Board of Education, the trustees of Michigan and Michigan State and Wayne State. So the conventions are doing a lot of that selection. Donald Trump weighed in very heavily in all of those statewide nominations. He came out in support of Tudor Dixon shortly before the primary, stayed out of it for a long time, probably waited to see how things were going to shake out, and it looked like she was emerging from the pack, and then he threw his support behind her, and that certainly put her over the top. Had he thrown his support behind one of the other candidates, and there were 5 at that point left in the field, you know, they may or may not have won the nomination. But you know, Dixon was, at least at the 11th hour, became the Trump choice. And certainly the convention, the Republican state convention, had a very Trumpy sort of feel to it. And the fact that they selected for Attorney General and Secretary of State election deniers, and people who, you know, had no political experience, their main claim to fame was the fact that they said the election had been stolen in 2020, the presidential election. That was sort of, that was their best attribute as candidates. Well, you know, that doesn't play very well in a statewide general election. And the fact that they couldn't expand beyond that in terms of what they might do to improve state government and so on and so forth, that was sort of all they had. You know, in some ways, it's not a surprise that those candidates lost. Tudor Dixon, a little bit different, right? First time as a candidate for public office, but somebody who has at least had, you know, something of a political profile leading up to the election. A little bit of an election denier too, although, you know, she was able to in some ways kind of move away from that. Didn't really have much of a campaign when it comes to, you know, being able to advertise and so on and so forth. Even just in general, her media appearances until relatively shortly before the election were kind of few and far between. When you're nominating people who haven't run for office before, who haven't gone through the process of putting together a campaign, who haven't gone through the process of raising money. You know, when it's your first time doing all that, that's a pretty steep learning curve. And when you don't have a strong campaign infrastructure to help lead you through that, it's going to be hard to win. Now, that happened in Michigan. There are a lot of other places around the country where weak candidates didn't do so well. And that's true both on the Democratic side as well as on the Republican side. Certainly, our attention was drawn to a lot of Republican candidates who seemed not quite ready for prime time. But there were Democratic candidates that fall into that camp as well, I think. And maybe we'll talk about some of those races when we talk more about what happened nationwide. So that's one piece of the puzzle, right? And it affects the way voters think about the Democratic Party because of the top of the ticket races. That has ramifications for what happens at the state legislative level, but the additional wrinkle at the state legislative level was the change in the redistricting process.
Right.
And you know, we can sort of talk about this a little bit more later on. We may want to do that, or we may not. But I think what happened, at least in this cycle in Michigan, is that the redrawing of the districts by the new Citizens Commission, the Independent Redistricting Commission, meant that no longer was it the case that the party that draws the districts, which for the last 3 cycles has been the Republican Party, no longer is it the case that they were sort of guaranteed a disproportionate number of legislative seats compared to the proportion of the votes that they got. This time around, I haven't seen sort of final vote count for state legislative districts, but the proportion of seats, if you sort of aggregate across all legislative districts in Michigan, Democratic votes correspond pretty well with Democratic seats. Republican votes correspond pretty well with Republican seats. Doesn't always work out that way, right? And so we can sort of say, at least it's not the case that sort of Republicans are guaranteed safe seats in the legislature from here on out. When more seats are competitive, you know, if every seat was a 50-50 seat where you don't have any idea going into the election who's going to win, a shift in votes of, you know, a handful of voters across each of those districts might mean that every seat is won by one party, 51 to 49, if they all break the same way, right? So it isn't necessarily the case that more competitive seats are always going to better reflect the underlying vote totals. But in this election cycle, that seems to be the case. And it's certainly the case that, if we had sort of had the old process and the Republican legislature got to draw the lines, Republicans would have done better in terms of winning seats, even if they didn't do better in terms of winning votes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing for us to pay attention to as citizens in Michigan. But again, there's no guarantee with competitive districts that it's always going to be that way.
But if you have states that are extremely gerrymandered,
right,
and you have that, right? I mean, Wisconsin is
right.
maybe a good example in our neighborhood, right?
Right.
Extremely gerrymandered by the Republican Party, and so much so that they were hoping that they would get a supermajority out of their gerrymandered district, so that it didn't matter that Tony Evers, the Democratic candidate for governor, got reelected.
Right.
He did. And they didn't get their supermajority, but they missed just by a couple. But they could have run roughshod over Tony Evers if they had successful.
Because of their process, it's all up to the legislature. The governor doesn't have much of a role in that, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, Florida is an extremely gerrymandered state. Ohio is trending in that direction. So it really, really matters. If you've got one party controlling the redistricting process in that state, and they go for maps that are heavily gerrymandered, as the traditional historical term is, then that can really, really have a big influence on the election.
That's right. And there are some Democratic examples too, so that, for instance, in New York State, the maps that were drawn by the legislature were thrown out by a judge, and the new maps were less heavily favored toward the Democrats.
Actually, they favored Republicans.
They favored Republicans, and especially in some key parts of the state, they favored Republicans, and as a result, Republicans picked up seats. So the way that the way that the maps are drawn makes a big difference. And you know, I think most people would agree that votes and seats ought to be somehow linked, and we saw that in Michigan this time, and I think we can hope that that would happen into the future. But again, if seats are competitive, it doesn't take a big swing one way or the other to potentially have a big swing in Lansing or in Washington for the congressional delegation.
Mm-hmm. So you would think then that the Voters Not Politicians method led to much more competitive races?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a challenge to draw districts, right? Because it's hard to think about what a set of legislative districts would look like if you were trying to draw all of the seats as perfectly competitive, when you've got voters sort of aggregated in kind of different ways. So we think about the east side of the state in the Detroit area, where Democrats do well sort of in the city, and they tend to do less well in the surrounding community. And you think about northern Michigan, both northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. It's sometimes hard to find Democratic voters to sort of cluster together. But sort of a great example is this Grand Rapids seat, right? The 3rd congressional district. In the previous redistricting maps for the last bunch of years, the city of Grand Rapids was divided into 2 or sometimes 3 different congressional districts. Like Kalamazoo, Central City Grand Rapids is more Democratic than the rest of Kent County. And when you take that block of Democratic voters and split them up, they don't have much influence in any of the districts that they're in. The new maps kept Grand Rapids City sort of all in one district that extended from the city kind of all the way over to the lake. That created a district that was much more competitive, and in fact it actually leaned Democratic, as opposed to under the old maps, and again, not just the previous map, but generations before that. When you split those Democrats apart, when you fracture that Democratic base, it's hard for any Democrats to win.
How about our congressional district here? It seems to me that the Democrats conceded that. They just thought, we don't have a chance. And I'm not sure that was the case. Looking back, I'm not sure they didn't have a chance. What do you think on that?
That's a great question. I used to always talk about how where we live, there's not a lot you can do, right? Because we got Indiana to the south, and we got the lake to the west, and you know, it's hard to make our corner of the state much different than it is. Well, the redistricting commission figured out a way. They created a district that ran across the entire southern border of the state from east to west, and didn't really see that coming. But the other piece of what's now the 4th district that Kalamazoo is in is that it's reconnected Kalamazoo and Battle Creek.
Yes.
There was an earlier time period where Michigan had sort of more districts, that the Kalamazoo Battle Creek district was a competitive district. But that's the seat that Howard Wolpe won for years,
exactly.
and Democrats certainly had a chance. You put those two pockets of Democratic voters together in a district, include Benton Harbor in that, and there's at least some opportunity there for Democrats to be successful. In this election cycle, the other piece that made it look like it at least had some potential for Democrats is that Bill Huizenga, who won the election, incumbent member of Congress, but he's from sort of the farthest northwest corner of the district. And most of the district had previously been represented by Fred Upton or by Peter Meyer, but not by Bill Huizenga. So he had to introduce himself to a new set of voters. Most of the people in the district had never voted for Huizenga previously. He did a really good job of that. He did a really good job of introducing himself to voters in a way that allowed him to kind of distance himself maybe from his past record, and there wasn't a lot of attention drawn to statements that he's made previously, votes that he's cast previously.
He didn't have to face any counter advertising. The opposing candidate ran no television ads whatsoever, so he had no attack ads to deal with. He didn't have to operate with attack ads on his own, so he could put forward himself and his, introduce himself, as you say,
in the best possible light. I think in hindsight, if the United States Congress looks like it's going to be controlled, the House looks like it's going to be controlled by Republicans, but by a narrow margin, I think in hindsight, folks are going to look at places like Michigan 4 and a few other districts across the country and say, boy, that's a missed opportunity, right?
Yeah. Is it just that the Democratic Party, Kalamazoo Democratic Party, couldn't find somebody, or the Democratic Party in the district? I didn't understand what happened, because it just seemed like all of a sudden,
I think they just conceded it. From the beginning, they thought, oh, we don't have a chance against this guy, so we're not going to bother. And then Joseph Alfonso, to his credit, stepped forward, but he had to be a write-in candidate
to get nominated.
And they gave him no money and no. In their literature, they barely mentioned him, so they just conceded.
Yeah, he was absent. I mean, you just didn't see.
He was virtually, and Don, you know that when you ran for Congress, you had experience in running campaigns. You had run for city commission successfully, and so you knew at least some of the pieces, right? Yeah. Some of the other Democratic candidates in what was the old district, Matt Lonejohn, Paul Clements, people like that. They put together campaign organizations. They were able to raise some money, not tons of money, but for Democratic challengers running against Republican incumbents like Fred Upton, they put together some pretty formidable campaign operations.
They did,
and we just didn't see that this time for whatever reason. Is it possible for first-time candidates to do that? It is. But it's awful tough.
It is tough.
It's awful tough. But I do think, I teach a graduate class. I'm teaching right now a graduate class on political parties, and one of the things that I try to convey to my graduate students, I'm not sure that they believe me when I tell them this, is that political parties are important for democracies to function. But functional political parties are important for democracies to function. Right. If you have dysfunctional parties, then that leads to dysfunctional democracies. We're seeing that right now on sort of different levels, but I do think that it ought to be a concern for us as citizens.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people say, well, we shouldn't have political parties. We'd be better off without them. I don't think that's the case. I think we'd be better off if we had political parties that were more functional. Part of what we expect parties to do is to be able to recruit candidates.
Right.
That's not something that happened in the 4th Congressional District at the time where you need to do that sort of early so that candidates have the opportunity to raise some money
That's
and
right.
to build some infrastructure, to be ready for that general election campaign. And again, we're not the only place that happened across the country. But I think in this district, the Democrats have to sort of look at what they did and what they didn't do and say, okay, what do we need to do differently?
Right.
Part of it is that there's a new district, right? And so it's not just candidates that have to figure out what to do in that district, but it's parties and other folks as well.
Yeah.
And so I think moving forward, they'll have a better understanding of what needs to be done. Moving forward, at least as long as Bill Huizenga is running for election, it's going to be harder to unseat Bill Huizenga because now he's created an impression in the minds of voters that's a pretty positive impression.
Yeah.
And again, that may or may not be consistent with much of what he's done in Congress up to this point.
Yeah, yeah. So redistricting was tremendously important. Gina, I think there was another issue that was really critical in Michigan. What do you think it is?
Right. So the proposals also drove people to the polls, and we were looking specifically at the impact of Proposal 3 around abortion rights and reproductive freedom, and looking at that impact. And I know we were seeing that we had two gubernatorial candidates. One had one position and one had the other. So we knew that these two things were going to be connected, that the Democrats would support this governor, but also support this issue, and it turned out in our favor. So how do you think that all played out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, a little bit of the backstory that I'm sure most people are familiar with already. It was just in the summer when the Supreme Court released its decision in the Dobbs case that overturned Roe versus Wade, and that meant different things in different parts of the country. Basically what it meant was what the Supreme Court said, there's no right to an abortion in the national Constitution, in the United States Constitution. What that then means is it's sort of up to every state to figure out where they're at. And there are some states that already had climates that were more supportive of reproductive freedom and a woman's right to choose. There are other states that were certainly less supportive of that. And we've seen a lot of action in the states as state legislatures and governors are trying to work through legislative processes to sort of create this new post-Dobbs framework.
Right.
Michigan is kind of in a weird place, right? Because on the one hand, the law that's on the books, which dates from 1931, not only criminalizes abortion, but is in a way that no state in the country that's sort of responding to Dobbs is criminalizing abortion, right? Because this was 1931.
Right.
It was 10 years after women got the right to vote nationally. And so, to sort of have that as the status quo puts Michigan in sort of a very, very strange place. On the other hand, that law isn't in effect because a judge said, wait a minute, we need to talk about this.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, the status quo from pre-Dobbs seemed to be in place in Michigan. What Proposal 3 did was to say, okay, let's put the language of sort of Roe in place here in Michigan. Let's
in the Constitution.
In the state constitution. So it wouldn't be up to the legislature to overturn that. It wouldn't be up to the sort of the whims of political expediency. It's going to be in the Constitution, and the way to take it out of the Constitution is to amend the Constitution again. That can be done, but certainly it's a challenge. So folks create this proposal. It becomes Proposal 3. It's numbered 3. Let's leave, in Michigan, there are two ways to amend the Constitution, two ways to start that process. One is to do it through the legislature, the other is to do it through citizen petitions. Proposal 3 came through the citizenry rather than through the legislature. But the way that we ratify amendments to the Constitution, the way we approve them, is that we let voters decide. And so Proposal 1, 2, and 3 were all constitutional amendments. Leave it to the voters, let them figure out what the Constitution should say. All 3 of them passed. All of the energy, from what I could tell, was around Proposal 3, right?
Yeah.
That gave that gave folks in Michigan who were concerned about abortion rights and concerned about women's reproductive health, that gave them something to focus on. And certainly it was important, across the country. It looks like, from exit polls and things, it looks like it was sort of especially important in Michigan, more important in other places. But also you could sort of see how in a place that already has reproductive freedoms enshrined in the Constitution, abortion is less of an issue, right? So in California or in Kansas, after the vote that they had over the summer, all of a sudden it's not as big an issue, right? It's been taken off the table already. In Michigan, we were due for a fundamental change, right? And if the state Supreme Court ultimately upheld the 1931 law, that's a huge change. Right? Now it's not going to come to that, right? Because now Proposal 3 has passed. What I think was smart about the way that the proposal was written, it was sort of a blessing and a curse, but I think it was smart. They left a lot of things to be determined, right? They didn't sort of put into the Constitution, these are all of the specifics. Instead, they said, this is the fundamental principle. This is how, that principle would be applied. It's up to the normal political process to sort of figure out how to make that work. And there's room for restrictions on abortion, as long as the fundamental right is protected. And so now what we'll see is the new legislature, controlled by Democrats with a Democratic governor, try to figure out, what some of that specific language should be and how that should look. I think that was smart, but I also think it got a lot of people that might otherwise sit out a midterm election mobilized and energized, and so that's where it affects turnout.
Yeah, and I think there was very good organizing. A lot of really good organizing around that. A lot of people that had experience in organizing joined in. Michelle Serlin locally really did a terrific job mobilizing people around that. So.
Yeah. Well, we want to get to the national scene as well here, but just one final question about Michigan. Now with unified control by the Democratic Party of the legislature, the governor's office, and the other top executive positions, what do you see happening? What do you see going forward now, the next couple of years?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we've seen through Gretchen Whitmer's first term was, at the start, a legislature controlled by Republicans that simply did not want to work with her at all. And there's perhaps blame on both sides in terms of communication going both ways and whatnot. But it was pretty clear that the Republicans in the legislature thought that they had a mandate from voters in Michigan, and the governor thought that she had a mandate that was a different mandate. And for the most part, they just didn't work well at all. That's changed a little bit over the last year, and certainly a lot of that was kind of under the radar, in part because of the sort of the influx of money from the national government to deal with the aftermath of COVID. Yeah. All of a sudden, it wasn't a question about should our dollar for state government go to this? Should it go to K-12 education? Should it go to higher education? Should it go to fix the roads? Should it go to prisons? Now we got $4. We give them each $1, right? Yeah. So they didn't have to make some tough choices in the last year, and they were able to sort of work together in a way to figure out how to spend that money. What that meant was that the last year of her first term, in a lot of ways, was different than the first 3. But the Republicans didn't want to make it seem like they were cozying up to her, and they didn't want to make it seem like that the reason that they could do this was because we were getting all this money from the national government. We love the national government. The Biden administration is. They didn't want to say that at all. So rather than sort of say, look at what we've accomplished, they pretended they didn't do anything, which I'm not sure that was a good collective strategy. Now that the Democrats have control, and the margins are going to be narrow, right? I'm not sure that all of the races have been decided, but it looks like the Democrats are going to control both the state Senate and the state House by a fairly narrow margin. My expectation is that most of the votes that they take could be party line votes. You could have, virtually all of the Republicans voting against and all of the Democrats voting for. and as long as that happens, bills move to the governor's office for her signature. We've seen that to some extent in Congress with evenly divided United States House and Senate in the first 2 years of Joe Biden's administration. And we know that sometimes that can be really frustrating for people that want to see action. They want to see movement. If the Democrats hang together the way that Republicans did when they controlled the state legislature, then we should see some movement on a lot of issues that are important to Democrats and important to Governor Whitmer. I think the thing they have to be aware of and concerned about is not overreaching their mandate, not sort of trying to go too far. And it'll be incumbent on Governor Whitmer, who served in the legislature previously, and so she's got an understanding of how legislative processes work. It's also going to be important for the state legislative leaders on the Democratic side to say, look, these are the aspirational goals. These are the things that we would love to see happen, but maybe we ought to temper those back at least a little bit, some of them, to figure out, kind of where's the center in Michigan? Where are most people in Michigan? Because we want public policies that aren't just what Democrats want. We want public policies that are going to be good for the entire state. And are we going to listen to those other voices that may not agree with us? Doesn't mean we have to, sort of do whatever the minority wants, but are we at least going to listen to those voices and then try and build on the good ideas that they have? And let me just say that when I think of a model for that, this guy's the model. Don Cooney's the model, right? Mm-hmm. Because it turns out, I've heard, you're pretty liberal in terms of your personal preferences.
True word.
Yeah.
True word.
But the other thing that I think has been such a way that Don has been such a great asset for our community, he's willing to work with anybody that's interested in solving problems. Mm-hmm. And so if Democrats approach it from that perspective, that let's hear what the good ideas are. Why do you think that would work better than what we're proposing? Is there a way that we could tweak the policy that we're putting forward to make it even better than it is now? Mm-hmm. If they're willing to do that, mm-hmm. The blame game, they're still going to be blamed if things don't go well. But they could create a stronger set of public policies, and they could avoid what commonly happens is that the party that sort of gets control for the first time overreaches, right, and moves too far in one direction or the other, such that they don't create policies that are sustainable, and they hurt their chances for election the next time around.
Now, I would mention too, John, I think, because I'm seeing this in the city, a lot of that COVID money is still there. I mean, we got $38 million from the government, and with general directions about how we could spend that in a lot of ways. We had 28 million of that left. And that's like amazing for us. We've been, sometimes when I've been on the commission, we're barely making our budget, but now we got this money. And I think one of the challenges with that kind of money is you don't want to create a cliff. You don't want to get something going and then 2 years, 3 years down the line, we don't have that money gone, and then people's expectations are that that's going to continue. So that's going to be interesting how they do all that.
Yeah, it will. And I think at the state level, pre-COVID, there were some structural problems with the budget, that the money going out was more than the money coming in. Oh. And Republicans traditionally have been interested in cutting taxes or shifting around tax burdens. Yeah. Democrats have been more interested in making sure that there was enough money there to support the programs that they thought were important. And so if that meant raising taxes or at least not cutting taxes, that was part of the Democrats' deal. Right now, with that money from the feds, they don't have to make those hard choices. But I think you're right, Don, that when that money from the feds goes away, we need to make sure that there aren't some structural problems that are going to kick in. Yeah. They're going to mean that we either have to jack up taxes or dramatically cut services. And those are some areas where, again, Democrats won majorities. They're in control of the process. But they ought not ignore reasonable concerns raised by other voices, whether that's other legislators that are on the other side of the aisle, or other voices more generally. And of course, the Democratic Party isn't completely unified on virtually anything, right? And so they'll be getting some alternative voices from within their own party that they'll need to figure out how to incorporate.
You remember the quip from Will Rogers way back in the day, right? He was asked if he belonged to an organized political party, and he said, no, I'm a Democrat. I don't belong to an organized political party. That's probably still true all these years later. Well, let's go to the national level now.
Before we do that,
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt the moderator, although I just did. One of the things that one of the ballot proposals that I think was really under the radar for most people was Proposal 1. And actually Proposal 1 and Proposal 2 both, if they had been the only ballot proposals,
would have been more
we would have had a really interesting conversation about each of them. But Proposal 1 kind of did two things, right? It changed the structure of term limits for our state legislature. And it also created some new disclosure requirements that hadn't existed in Michigan before. Michigan was one of the least transparent states when it came to that. And so in part, the idea was, okay, people aren't going to want to change term limits, but if we throw in this disclosure sweetener, then that's going to help.
Yeah.
I heard almost no one talking about Proposal 1 in the run-up to the election.
Right, yeah, okay, buried.
I think this is going to be good for Michigan. I'm not an advocate of term limits generally. I think that the term limits that have been in place in Michigan have really hurt the state in a number of ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I like about this new the new term limits under Proposal 1, it actually reduces the amount of time that somebody can serve in the legislature in terms of their overall service, but it allows them to serve all of that time
in one house or the other,
in either the House or the Senate.
That's right.
And so we're likely to see some folks spend all 12 years that they're allowed to serve in the legislature in the state house, for instance, which means that we don't have first-term members of the legislature chairing important committees, which means that we're not electing party leaders who basically are still trying to figure out how to find the bathroom. Yeah. I mean, this will allow some folks to say, I want to devote my entire legislative service, my entire public service to just the House or the Senate. That's going to give me some time to develop some expertise in matters of public policy. Right, exactly. It's going to help me understand better the legislative process. It's going to help me to take a longer view of public policy rather than to say, look, I'm only going to be here for a couple of years. What matters to me is what's going to happen just in that short time frame. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be good for us as a state. Mm-hmm. And I hope that as things unfold and as we see potential candidates making choices about what they're going to do, we'll see some of that experience being helpful to us in the state legislature, because we simply haven't had that for the last several decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Proposal 2 is important also because, so much of the energy after 2020 was in terms of restricting voter rights in all kinds of different ways. This expands voter rights within the state, sort of going in the opposite direction, allows early voting, and I think makes it generally easier for people to participate in the democratic process. Right?
That's right, and I think that's a good thing. There aren't a lot of changes from the way things are operating right now, but it puts them into the state constitution, so it makes it difficult for some future set of decision makers to sort of say, wait, we don't want people to vote. We want to make it harder for people to vote. And I think that, again, if that was the only thing on the ballot, I think there would have been a robust discussion about what it meant. But, there was a little more attention to Proposal 2 than Proposal 1. But really, Proposal 3 was the big driver.
Right, and as it probably should have been.
Yeah.
Because, well, let's look at the national level. So, again, Republicans anticipating the historical trend that they would gain a lot of seats. So the talk about a red wave, but didn't happen. It's likely that the House of Representatives is going to go to Republican control, but by a relatively small margin. The Senate is somewhat of a toss-up, although I think a lot of what I've been reading sort of says, well, I think the Democrats have a slight edge there. They're probably going to win Arizona. They still have a chance in Nevada, and Reverend Warnock might survive the runoff in Georgia. And again, it would be back to unless they win all three of those, we're back to, if they only win 2 of the 3, we're back to 50-50, but then Vice President Harris comes into play. So, so what's it mean that the Republicans now control the House of Representatives. What does that mean to the Biden administration? What's it mean for the country? But it's a very narrow margin.
Yeah, that's a great question. The United States House of Representatives operates much more along party lines than the Senate does, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. If the Republicans, with their very narrow majority, decide that basically their best strategy is to pretend that there are no solvable problems facing the country for the next 2 years, they could spend the next 2 years just simply trying to create problems for the Biden administration and waiting till the next presidential election in order for anything to get done, with the expectation that somehow things will be better for them and we can take care of the problems then on terms that are more beneficial to us.
That was the Obama strategy. That's how they acted with Obama.
Yep, and the idea was, we'll just delay. We'll be as obstructionist as we can be. And guess what? If we're not interested in solving problems, that frees up a lot of our time. We can spend that on things like investigating Hunter Biden and things that we're going to call oversight that really aren't about oversight, right? They're really about how can we better position Republican candidates in 2024 rather than solving the problems that are facing the country in 2022, 2023, and nearly all of 2024 before the next election. Representative Fred Upton, who served the district that includes Kalamazoo since the 1980s, was part of the Problem Solvers Caucus.
Yes.
The Problem Solvers Caucus is a bipartisan group, same number of Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives, who, their interest was solving problems. I mean, when Fred Upton got elected in 1986, there were maybe 30 folks who weren't interested in solving problems. When Fred Upton retired from Congress, there were 30 folks in the Problem Solvers Caucus. And the other 405, it's not that they weren't concerned about solving problems, but they didn't have that same focus on, how can we make how can we make things better for the American people?
That's right.
Michigan has been overrepresented in the Problem Solvers Caucus. Peter Meijer was a member, Debbie Dingell was a member, a couple other Democrats have been part of that. There are only 30 members nationwide, and almost half, I think, of the Michigan delegation was in that caucus. They didn't have a huge impact on public policy because, again, they're minority within both parties. But in a closely divided House, there's at least an opportunity for folks who are interested in doing something that's good for the country between now and the next election. And the elections are about choosing who the deciders will be. It's then up to the deciders to figure out how they're going to spend their time, right? In that governing phase, the phase between elections, that's really the important phase.
Sure.
That's when the work gets done. Instead, most of us sort of focus on the elections, and the election's over and go, oh, thank goodness, I'm glad that's done. I can ignore politics until the next election. Well, it's the governing part that matters.
Yeah.
It's going to be incumbent on the Republican Party in Congress, should they be in the majority, in either the House or the Senate, to decide how they want to behave. Haven't seen a lot of good signs based on, at least the leadership and some of the more vocal members of the Republican Party. But now they're in the majority, or we expect them to be in the majority in the House. Now they actually have responsibility. And will they engage that responsibility and behave responsibly? Or will they behave the same way that they did when they were in the minority, and it didn't so much matter what they did because it was up to Democrats to figure out how to solve the problem?
Right.
That's going to be the big question for them, right? Governing is hard. Complaining is easy. Governing is hard, and so it'll be interesting to see how they do decide to engage with the Biden administration and with the Senate, which, even if Republicans are able to get a majority in the Senate, which at this point is still unknown, the Senate works differently. And so it's quite likely that the Senate Republicans will be thinking about policy from a more moderate perspective than House Republicans will. even if they have the majority. And if they don't have the majority, so you've got one chamber controlled by Republicans and one chamber controlled by Democrats, how are they going to work together with the Biden administration to try and improve the quality of life for most Americans? And it's up to them.
And looming over all of this is Donald Trump.
Yes.
Yes. So has Trump been weakened enough by the fact that the red wave didn't materialize, some of the candidates that he foisted on the, use that term because I think many Republicans are using that term, foisted on them, lost? Has he been weakened enough that his grip, ironclad grip over the party has been shaken or broken a little bit, or is he going to call the tune? I mean, is he going to be the Speaker of the House?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that just in the way that former President Trump has lashed out over social media in the last couple days suggests that he thinks he's been weakened, that he thinks his brand has been damaged. And so he's attacking, everybody from Ron DeSantis to, whomever else as being responsible for the fact that Republicans didn't do better. It's not because of him.
If they win, it's his, heads he wins, tails you lose, right?
Exactly.
Every time.
Yeah. So, my best guess is that, last week before the election, there were an awful lot of Republicans who said, man, I can't, no matter what I think, I can't cross Donald Trump because then I'm doomed. Now it turns out that even if you don't cross Donald Trump, you may not win. Certainly things are different in primary elections than in general elections, but his brand is weak, weaker than it was a week ago. Where does the strength of his brand come from? It comes from the fact that people allow him to be strong. Yeah. There's nothing inherent in being a former president that gives you power. It's the fact that other folks, and especially Republicans, were very deferential to him. And now they may think that they don't have to do that to the extent that they did before. And he's been sort of teasing a big announcement. He's teased a lot of big announcements that never came to fruition in the past. Most people expected that to be him declaring his candidacy for the presidency. But there are some Republicans who are now saying at least wait until after the Georgia runoff.
Right.
Because look what happened last time. You destroyed our chances to control the Senate by sucking up all the oxygen in the room, by creating a dynamic in Georgia where voters all voters didn't reject Donald Trump, but they took 2 Senate seats that Republicans thought they should have won in the general election. They thought they should have won them in the runoff, and they lost both of them. And so, there are some Republicans who are saying, at least be quiet, at least until December 7th, right? And then, you can go back to your own self.
All right, we only have a couple minutes left. You guys have any last questions for Professor Clark here about the election? There's a lot of things that we had hoped to get to that we didn't really get to, but this has been great. Any last questions?
Just one last, people were watching school board elections very closely because of the culture wars that are going on and PACs that are supporting these candidates who are advocating for parental rights to make sure they know what's going on in schools. What is the trend there? How do you think this will play out?
Political scientists, by and large, have not paid a lot of attention to elections for things like school board. There are a few political scientists, and I give them a lot of credit, that have been kind of watching this over time. As the parent of a K-12 child, it's fascinating for me to think about the way that parents talk about involvement and control, and as an educator, to think about what that means in my day job, right? And for all of us, that's what we do. I don't think that in places like Michigan, some of the most extreme elements of parental control and whatever, got much more than a foothold. But certainly in other parts of the country, we've seen folks who have that perspective really, take over school boards, and they've certainly, even if they haven't taken them over, they've made it they've made what's already a difficult job even more difficult and more unpleasant.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm certainly hopeful that through education and understanding, we can do a better job of letting parents and other citizens understand what education is and how it works. You know, we all know this. Everybody who has had a class thinks they're now the expert on every class. And everybody that's gone through, you know, K-12 education thinks they know best about how to educate other folks. And I might not agree with that viewpoint. But you know, it will also be interesting for some of those folks once they are elected to school boards and once they see the decision-making process and once they have a better understanding of what the curriculum is and how it's created. You know, some of them have said in the past when these kinds of things have, some of those folks have said, oh, okay, now I get it. Let's get down to business and do the work of education. Others of them have said, oh, this isn't what I thought it was at all. I can't have the impact that I want because there's nothing to impact. I'm out of here, right? I'm not gonna finish my term. I'm not gonna run for election. If that's what happens, if that sort of socialization process takes place, you know, maybe we're in better position overall than we might otherwise have been.
All right. John, it's been great to have you on the show today. We had a whole lot more that we wanted to get to, but there was so much there. I mean, this was a very important election, a lot to unpack, and we may have to have you come back again. Some of the things I wanted to get to is maybe like what's going to happen in 2024, right? Because we never stopped the election cycle. One ends and the other begins immediately, right? So. Perhaps we can revisit some of the other issues that we didn't get to this time next time. I also want us to focus on what's happening over in Egypt at the Conference of the Parties 27, dealing with the climate issue. And I think we may need to reach out to our good friend Denise Keel and get her back here to give us an assessment of what's going on over there. Very important conference. So there's just really a lot to talk about. Lots of critical issues out there. And lots of different viewpoints. And again, thank you very much, John. It was really great to get your political science perspective on what's happening with the election. Great. So again, thanks to my fellow panel members, thanks to John Clark from the Political Science Department, and we thank you for joining us. I hope you come back and visit us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.